those managers develop throughout your organization, having them understand exactly what engagement is about, the role they play in the whole engagement scheme. It's not just the organization that comes back and our scores were very low. Well, that comes back down to every manager.
If it's Friday, it's the CEO series. Our guest today is Kevin Grossman, president of the Talent Board, board member of the Candidate Experience Award. Founded in 2011, the first nonprofit research organization focused on the elevation and promotion of a quality candidate experience with industry benchmarks that highlight accountability, fairness, and business impact. He also hosts the popular Talent Board, the C&E Shop Talk podcast that covers recruiting and the candidate experience. And with that, I welcome Kevin. How are you?
Ron, so good to see you.
Good to see you.
We were just talking that before, it's been quite a while since we saw each other in person, and that was in Singapore in November of 2019, right?
2019, yeah. That afternoon, good experience. And now we're here 2 years later, trying to pick up on that conversation.
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you too. And I'm glad you were able to make it. Didn't realize you were West Coast time, but it's good that you're here. So Thank you very much for being a member, being a part of this show today.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's start out by talking about, some people may have heard the intro and said, candidate experience, what's that all about? Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So a lot of organizations and HR talent acquisition leaders and their teams define candidate experience a little bit differently, but I think at the core of it, the way that we define it, and I think I would argue it's pretty universal globally, is it's every single interaction that a candidate has, external candidates as well as internal, because we're talking about current employees too, looking for other opportunities inside the organization. So every interaction that they have with automation, with human interaction, the communication, the engagement or lack thereof, that then impacts their overall perception of fairness in the process. It's not about happy, Ron, because they're only going to be happy if they get the job, right?
Yeah.
And then that in turn, with the impacting the perception of fairness, whether it will then impact whether or not they decide to do stuff again with an organization, apply again in the future, refer others, and for consumer-based businesses, make purchases or influence making purchases.
Oh, okay. Never would have thought of that part of it, that part of the equation. So why should organizations be, well, first of all, why should organizations be concerned about the so-called candidate experience? And we're talking from reviewing and submitting as a first step. Is that where it starts?
We would say, from our research vantage point, it's really even before that. I mean, it is even before, from the moment that a candidate is interested in your business, your brand, before they even apply for a job, and whatever that interest is, that's where the experience starts. Because again, every interaction, every piece of information they're consuming about that business and that brand is informing their perception of that brand. If they decide to apply, and this is where a lot of organizations would think, okay, once I apply, then I'm literally a candidate at that point. But again, we would argue that everybody's a potential candidate at any given time, Ron. We're all we're all perpetual candidates. So anything of interest could turn our heads and say, wow, I want to check out that particular opportunity, without even being, because most of us, and we see this in our research, most of us are doing our own research for any organization, wherever that is. It's a much smaller group of people who are getting sourced, right? I'm a recruiter finding you because you're the hard to find person for this role, whether it's senior management, technical positions, the list goes on. But most of us are doing our own research about an organization.
So if we take a look at the candidate experience and we look at relationship values, we could say, do you have any, in your research, is there linkage between that experience and tenure, linkage between that experience and engagement?
So yes, with engagement. So let me first tell you this scenario. So for any given job, let's say there's 100 people that are applying for a job, and I know this is going to vary across job type, that are interested in one particular job. Most of those individuals, they're going to research that organization and that job, whether that's for 5 minutes or 5 hours, and they're going to apply, and that is the end of the road.
Okay.
They will never go any farther than that. Most of them, as we know, if you run the numbers for any organization, most are just not going to be qualified enough to get to that next level of being screened, assessed. So that's the limited experience that they have. And a lot of that for work with any company of any hiring volume or scale, that is mostly automated with auto response, with, sometimes impersonal messages that go out. Thanks very much for your application. We'll be in touch. When a lot of times candidates feel like they're not in touch again at the end of the day, or hopefully they get a timely rejection, because if you're not qualified, you should be rejected in a timely fashion,
right?
And not held on to until weeks later once that rec is filled. So that's the reality for most candidates at the end of the day. But we do know candidates only care about one thing. We've all been there ourselves too. They only care about getting the job.
Yeah.
They don't care about the technologies that you use. They don't care about your processes, all the work that you've done internally. It doesn't matter. I just want the job, right? So most candidates aren't getting the job. So then what do we find that connects to, that makes a better experience for the candidates and their willingness to do stuff again with the organization? Because think about the aggregate number of people who are being rejected is huge compared to those being hired. Mm-hmm. So that number over time could eat away at your business and your brand. And we see it. Candidates are talking online. They're going to Glassdoor, Indeed, Seek, Kununu, Fairy Godboss. They're posting reviews about their experience, right? Interview process they've been through. They're sharing all that. So here are the things that connect the dots to what we find as competitive differentiators every year. And this is partly answering your question. Communication and feedback loops. So consistent communication with candidates and employees, for that matter, because employees are having to be constantly re-recruited to be retained, I would argue. That consistent communication throughout the process. Expectation setting. What's going to happen after I apply? What's going to happen after I'm screened? After I'm interviewed? Those next steps, and following through on those next steps. Asking candidates for feedback, whether it be like in our benchmark research program and or companies who are doing continuous feedback already, where they're asking. Most companies, the comfort level is to ask new hires for feedback. Mm-hmm. And employees, and that's great, and there's valuable data there. But we would argue you should ask your rejected candidates as well about their experience. And so the feedback loops, and then providing feedback, Ron, to finalists. You're not going to do that at the point of application, but companies, and we see this in our data and research, that are providing feedback to finalists, job fit, qualification status feedback as to why I'm not going to pursue you any further. Okay. That raises the bar, that you get a bump in positive sentiment there, being transparent and accountable. Okay. And we can talk a lot about what we saw in 2020 versus previous years in our data and research. And then again, lastly, it's not about happy, because I'm only going to be happy if I get hired. It's about the perception of fairness at the end of the day.
You mentioned responses. I've always said that, you apply for a job online, you click send, that's a bottomless pit. Yeah. So you said the response a bottomless pit. Yeah. So it just goes there. You never hear anything back. So I mentioned to you before we came online about Airbnb, and they saw that same thing happening, and they went back and looked at their FAQs. In other words, enhancing that process. Mm-hmm. And what they did was they created kind of here's how we're going to follow up. Here's the timeline. Here's what will happen. And even for people that did not make it, as you said, research points this out, they came back to those people who were, I think their coin term we're silver medalists. So the goal is number one, the person that gets the silver medalist. The importance of that.
It is. So think about this for a minute. Again, I go back to my example of the majority of candidates for any given job are not going to be qualified.
Yeah.
All right. So, and that those are the individuals that are usually dispositioned the quickest, or hopefully in a timely fashion. They're not going to get a lot of communication and engagement from those employers, again, of any hiring volume or scale. But that other group, the group that gets screened, assessed, and interviewed, and makes it to those, and again, that silver medalist stage, meaning they're in the finals, but they're just not selected. That's the group that has the most human interaction with you, and the one who could be the most vocal, positive or negative, about their experience, right? Because they've gone beyond that kind of technology realm that is so pervasive in recruiting and hiring now, and it's not going, and will only grow. Mm-hmm. But the human interaction part, those are in the finalist stages. So yes, especially ensuring that your silver medalists, those finalists, even bronze, some people, say bronze medalists too. So it's tiered. That group of that future fit group that maybe could fit a position later on, you definitely want to make sure that they've been communicated with in a timely fashion, because it is, even with you or working with a team that you've got, each individual recruiter's got dozens of recs, and you're working really hard. You've got to bake into your process to make sure that the time to communicate as personally as you can and as timely as you can it needs to be a top priority, because it will pay dividends in the long run. To give you an example, globally last year, approximately, out of all of our data, over 30% of all the candidates who responded to our research surveys said that they would still be extremely likely to refer others. And over 90% of those didn't get hired, Ron.
Okay.
So think about that as a referral pool. Does anybody think about rejected candidates as referral? Right? But it happens, though. It can happen.
Yeah. I read an interesting piece from an organization, I forget the company now, and what they did, that silver medalist program, they built in a strategy around that. So silver medalists, for folks that not following this is for people that came through the process and were right at the finish line, but someone else was selected. And they built in a program. They added them to their newsletter. They had this newsletter, and they kept them informed on things that were happening inside of the organization, growth prospects, all those kind of things. Kept the engagement going, because how many times do we hear, we'll keep it on file and we'll get back to you?
Well, right. And what's the reality of that happening? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, even, and that's the thing, right? I mean, most of us, we, as professionals, and, I'm running this organization now, you're running your organization, but we remember the experience of being a job candidate, right? We know you probably have positive examples. I know I do of how I was treated, but we certainly don't forget the negative ones, though.
Yeah.
And there are individuals. Not everybody puts their money where their mouth is. If company X, if I had a really poor experience, but I really want to work for company X, I may still keep trying. Right? I may not throw the towel in, but there are going to be those individuals who don't. And I'll give you. And here's the thing: we talk in consumer-based businesses, it definitely can impact purchasing decisions. I mean, there's a lot of companies in the candy community that we work with that, being publicly traded too, they're not going to share the quantification that they've done of this potential impact on their business, but they're doing it though. And they know that it can cost millions of dollars a year in potential lost revenue if candidates as customers choose not to be customers anymore. But the other side of that, though, there's a positive too, though, right? So I'll give you an example. So you're familiar with Kimberly-Clark, right? Yeah. So a lot of paper products. A few years ago, they started on the journey of improving their overall recruiting and hiring process, and then in turn, the candidate experience. They also knew that, listen, we have a lot of candidates that apply for our jobs and our own employees who are our customers too, at the end of the day. So they started a program where they first they determined that the lifetime value of their customer was $30,000.
Okay.
So they're like, okay, that's great. If we could convert a few percentage points of our rejected candidates into customers because they had a decent experience, their perception of fairness was high enough for them to say, you know, I'm bummed I didn't get the job, but you did everything you said you were going to do. Exactly. And you communicated with me. Then they actually gave coupons away to rejected customers to buy their products.
Okay.
And that generated hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue.
Wow.
And continues to this date. And they're not the only example of that. Companies have experimented with this. And again, it's true. Just because I get rejected doesn't mean I'm not going to want to be associated with your business or your brand. So, and other companies have done this in the past too. I always like to, and then when you think about B2B companies, right? It's not the same thing. We've got what we call a resentment calculator on our website, where companies can plug in call a resentment calculator.
Oh, so boy.
Yeah, seriously, a candidate resentment calculator. So they can plug in some numbers, some hiring numbers, and then the value of a paying customer. And it computes based on our global resentment that we track in our research. Because resentment to us means that those percentage of candidates who say they're never going to do anything with you again.
Yeah.
So that calculation that's run gives companies an idea of what that potential negative impact could be. Now, B2B companies are like, well, nobody's going to not buy stuff, right? So I'll use Lockheed Martin as an example. They're long time. They've won Candy Awards 8 of the past 10 years that we've been running this. So I'll pick on them only because it's part of my analogy. So if I'm an engineer and I applied at Lockheed Martin, I had a horrible experience. I'm not going to not buy military equipment because I didn't get hired.
Yeah.
But I've got 3 engineering friends over here, and I'm going to tell them about my experience. And let's assume, again, this is all, projections. One of those engineering friends decides not to apply. That could have been the next key hire for Lockheed Martin. It's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Right. So those are just a positive and a negative example of what we talk about. Again, we've been talking about the business impact for a few years now, because it's not just about, it's candidate experience in and of itself is important. And it's always been a priority to a lot of companies globally around the world, but everybody sees it a little bit differently. But we're trying to connect the dots for organizations that it does impact your business.
One of the key points that you're making, and it kind of comes up to organizations as it relates to people, is that you're treating them as customers.
Yeah.
If you look at your employee population, 5,000, 1,000, those are customers. And if you use the same type approach that you would do from a marketing perspective, customer experience, those kinds of analogies and those numbers, we can track the same thing, because basically what you're talking about is trying to get the numbers behind it, and the numbers could connect to a so-called business case behind it.
You can,
because I'm sure that a lot of CEOs have never given thought, beyond that. That's just something that happens in HR, and that's no concern as it relates to business.
Right, but that's one of the things that we've been trying to change in business leadership from the top down. I mean, we know a lot of the companies that participate in our research, most of them, they're already leaning into change, right? Because they understand, okay, even if they had some internal data already about candidate feedback and experience, they want to be able to benchmark it against other companies and industries. So that's what our model is that anonymously and confidentially, they'll be able to do that, to benchmark against other like companies by size, industry. And it's all based on who participates every single year, but it's really good feedback for them at the end of the day. But we know the more that we've done this and the more that we dig into this, that we're really trying to emphasize again that whole idea of candidate as customer, again, even in the B2B realm, that impacting your referrals significantly, it's harder to quantify at the end of the day. But we do know that it's definitely it's impactful for right now, Ron. You know this. We're in this place now. Let me, if it's okay, I wanted to just talk about 2020 a little bit, right? So pre-COVID, we had been measuring candidate experience in nothing but a growth market.
Okay.
For 9 years. Right? Because this program was founded shortly after coming out of the Great Recession. So year after year, job growth, lowest unemployment in decades, globally, but especially in the States. And candidate resentment, as I just outlined it, that percentage that was actually growing at the pre-COVID. Then everything changed, right? So employers everywhere are like, what do we tell our candidates that had interviews scheduled that can no longer, we have to virtualize everything.
Okay. Yeah.
And maybe they were already doing virtual, which a lot of companies do in pockets. But now with the exception of essential on-site workers, plant stores, the list goes on, where that's another population we don't talk a lot about because not everybody can work remote, right? Mm-hmm. But what do? We have to virtualize everything. We have to constantly everything's changing for us as a business. So we got to keep telling our candidates, I'm sorry, we're having to freeze hiring right now, but come back and visit us later. Yeah. This level of empathetic communication really increased because not only what do we keep saying to our candidates, what do we say to our employees? Like, how are we are trying to prevent furloughs and layoffs. This is what's going on with the business right now. This is what we know. And it kept changing and it still keeps changing, right? Going into this year. So we saw not only this higher level of empathetic communication between employers, candidates, and employees. Candidates, by the very nature that it wasn't quite a candidate market anymore, although it was not like the Great Recession recovery either, they were more forgiving in the process. And we know that there's still millions out of work, and there was a big hourly population too, right, that really lost their job, a lot of jobs last year. And so that combination, we actually saw higher candidate ratings, positive ratings, and lower resentment in the past year than what we were expecting to see.
Wow. That's completely upside down.
It is. We didn't think it was going to go that way, but that's the way it went. Now it'll be interesting to see. We're only just now capturing data for this year. Mm-hmm. And companies, it's still open right now. It goes through August before we close the surveys and start analyzing the data. But it'll be interesting to see what happens now. That things are, opening up, but then still surging on the COVID side. But it wasn't just COVID, right? It was the impact of social and racial injustice and inequity everywhere. Mm-hmm. Just general upheaval throughout the year into this year that has impacted the world of work across the board. And now organizations, it's interesting. We're doing this little mini side survey like we did this last year about asking companies about the impact of their hiring of COVID, et cetera. We're doing it now looking at how they're going back to work, right? And so companies are concerned that if our business leadership makes everybody go back on site, besides the people who have to be on site, we're going to lose competitiveness because there are teams who are willing to walk because I have other remote opportunities over here. I don't want to go back to the office.
Exactly.
Right now. So that's a solid worry that we're seeing in this kind of mini survey that we're doing right now. Mm-hmm. And how it impacts their new or sustained or maybe rebooted inclusive hiring practices. That's also top of mind, right? And how does everything we're doing now impact that right now when we're truly going beyond checking the box and we really want to hire a more diverse, inclusive workforce?
Okay.
So
how does an HR department or a leadership team that's listening in and they want to better understand the candidate experience, is there a product that you have put out based on all of your research as to how someone can become, say, a certified candidate experience expert or whatever the title could be? Walk us through that.
Yeah, so Ron, that's a great question. But prior to this year, and still to this date, all of the resources. So everything that we do is in the form of research reports, articles, webinars, workshops. All those resources are on our site at thetalentboard.org, and most of them are free to download, especially our research and resources. So that's one place to start for companies that aren't familiar with Talent Board and the research that we do, to kind of get an idea of, I see now, I understand that it's every stage of recruiting and hiring impacts candidate experience, right? And as an employee too. So that's one place. We also launched a new learning program this year. So this is a program that we did in conjunction with HR.com, where it's a certificate of learning program. It's a 6-week professional development course that goes from building the business case of making changes and improvements in recruiting and hiring, and then it goes from every stage, pre-application all the way to onboarding, in all these different modules over time. And we're excited. We did it in conjunction with HR.com, and we piloted it at the beginning of the year. We've already had a couple of classes now the first class that started, the next class is starting, and it's just only beginning to grow. And we're excited about it because, again, it's based on what we've found over the past 10 years and then some.
Okay. Okay. So let's walk through the candidate experience. I'm hired. So the next step would be that onboarding experience. Now, I know we have pre and post. Pre, it may be virtual. Post, we didn't get there yet. How important is the onboarding, first day, first week? And so we have all this research from this side. What's the research telling you from the other side?
So what we found, because you're right, because we go all the way to day one.
Okay.
And that's what we're asking candidates. We're not asking post-hire questions. But what we do know is, for those who have been made offers and accept those offers and are going to start, the more engagement and prep that happens prior to day one, the more of a retention starter out of the gate you get. Because we find, what we see in our data is that when they're immersed in the company culture, they're already getting to meet, even virtually, potential teammates, colleagues. You get all that pesky paperwork out of the way, right? Before day one, all of those things, and getting somebody really moving on day one, instead of what we've all joked about for too many years, I think, is that you hire somebody. Again, it's a different experience in a small business, right, versus mid-size versus global enterprise. But that whole idea is you hire somebody, then you parachute them into the jungle and say, welcome. And then it's week 2 and they're finally getting their laptop, right?
Yeah.
So as much as you can get done so people can begin to be as productive as they can from day one, when that's done, it's a much higher positive ratings. And we would argue that what happens after that is going to depend on their experience as an employee. But that is a great way to start when all that stuff's happening before.
Okay.
And it's not always easy for companies to do that, but we do find that is a best practice that we see, a proven practice.
Okay. So I like the way you talked about that. If I come in at that level seeking this job, I got the job, I'm at a higher level. So if we blow that day one experience, week one experience, that could dip somewhat. So there has to be synergies between the two.
There does. And listen, even our highest rated candy winning companies around the globe, every year, they're not doing everything right all the time. That's impossible. I mean, there's things that are impacting the business, as you know, all the time, right? There's who plans for a pandemic, number one, right? Changes on the leadership team, changes on the recruiting team, new products and service launches. So maybe we are freezing hiring one day and we're surge hiring the next. Economic fluctuations. I mean, the list goes on. And what we find is the hardest part, companies may identify 1, 2, or 3 things they can improve in their recruiting process, right? And this is what we try to help them with in our research and other activities that we do. But sustaining that over time is the hard part. Because of the changes that I just outlined that are going to impact that. And it may be that candidate experience, business leadership is on board with it. It's a top priority. Maybe you're implementing a new ATS or CRM or some recruiting technology systems. You've got a new chatbot. You're really focused on all of these things, and then you merge with another company.
Yeah.
Right. And that everything.
It's kind of like a puzzle. You had all the pieces in place, and you're marveling over that somebody comes along and goes.
Well, that's what you're right. It's like throwing the puzzle. It's funny because my wife loves putting puzzles together, especially during COVID. And but yes, it's like that, because if I ever did that to her, I'd be out of the house. Out of the house.
You'd be flying over here to Dubai to live with me, right?
That's right, I would be. But that's a great image, though, because that's what it is. But that's the reality of the world of work, right, in business, because there's going to be mergers and acquisitions, and there's going to be these changes that have to be adapted to, and it's not easy for a lot of complex organizations to do. Although, in all fairness, I think to many organizations of all complexity and sizes, a lot of companies had to change real fast last year. Yeah. Right. And go virtual and get it all into place. And their teams, their recruiting teams got leaner, even for those industries that fared okay the past year, better than others, and leaning on their technologies more than ever before. They had to pivot. We use throw those words around like being agile and all those other things, but they had to be pretty quickly.
Yeah. All the so-called buzzwords.
Well, they are buzzwords, but I mean, I think the reality is that they did have to pivot pretty quickly, right, to be able to still function as an organization. And maybe unfortunately, there were still furloughs and layoffs. But you look at some of the jobs report, like for March was much better. At least in the States, and we'll see how that begins to fare as we move forward, because we are seeing the pandemic is not going away anytime soon, even with more and more people getting vaccinated, but it will impact how we go back to work too. So that's one thing that we see.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier in our conversation, you mentioned empathy from the side of the organization.
Yeah.
Purpose. Is kind of what I hear a lot, the purpose of the organization moving forward.
Yep.
Can we tie that into this dynamic, the purpose side or the empathy side of?
So you mean in how we treat our employees and our candidates?
Yeah.
I mean, I think sure. I mean, what I think what we worry about is how much of that will be sustained for the second half of this year and then going into 2022, because I mean, the reality is that there will be some in businesses that whatever that number is, that will go back to business as usual, probably. And it won't, and maybe that emphasis on keeping communication empathetic and frequent may wane. I hope it doesn't, but so that's why I'm interested to see what we see in our research this year, at least how the candidates respond. But I do think that those, so many companies they're getting a lot of pressure, and rightly so, from their own employees, right? And not just about how are we responding to COVID, but how are we responding to injustice? Mm-hmm. Sure. And I think that we're seeing that playing out in a lot of organizations. And again, how that will be sustained, it will be interesting. But I hope that those who really, truly believe in that empathetic mission and purpose, business, there's a lot of good things that business has done and can do, but business is also about growing and sustaining profitability. We can't get away from the fact that it's about, it's still, we're not in business to, I mean, we're not educational nonprofit, right? And we focus on elevating and promoting a quality candidate experience, but we're still in business. Yeah. And we're trying to figure out what we need to do. We're growing as Talent Board. We want to be able to continue to further our mission, but that still takes the dollar, right?
Yeah. In the end, it's coming back to the revenue must be there to sustain the mission.
Well, it does. Yeah. And I mean, but I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive, though. I think you can still, you can be purposeful, driven. You can have, sustainability and community-based initiatives that your organization is and focuses on and invests in beyond, it's not just about having a separate foundation that you run and do these things with. I mean, you could really truly believe that and try to foster that inclusiveness. It's not about culture fit. It's about what do you bring to our organization, and let's belong together. And those aren't just kumbaya sentiments. I mean, I would, some people may choose to work in a toxic environment. I never would, but I mean,
Yeah, I've left quite a few toxic environments without a job. I said, I can't deal with it anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it is what it is. But I think that I just hope that we see a lot of this empathetic behavior from business to continue into 2022.
Yeah.
So.
Well, to pick up on that, take it a step further. So you said some will possibly revert back to
probably
free, but there's going to be an effect from that side, because there's going to be people that says, you know what, I don't want to do this because I see other organizations that are more in line with my purpose, empathy, caring for more. And you're saying, I need everyone back here 5 days a week, because it's kind of like it's out of the box now. And it is going to be absolutely, and I have this discussion with senior leaders all the time. You can't go back to that.
No.
At your own risk. So give us some thoughts from your side, from a more research data kind of perspective.
So we have, about 50 right now, again, I was mentioning that kind of mini survey that we're doing now. That's beyond just the benchmark research that we do. And we're going to do a series of these again. This is the first one. We'll do it through the summer because things will continue to change through the summer as more people get vaccinated. And companies right now are asking each other. I know a lot of the people in our Candy community are asking each other, how are you going back to work?
Okay.
And about 50% so far in over 100 companies that have responded to date are saying that it will be some mix of remote and on-site, because there's going to be individuals. I mean, depending on what kind of business you're in an industry, again, we can't forget and need to be grateful for, I would argue, for essential employees that never had a choice.
That's right.
Right? That never had a choice to be, because there's folks that still need to be in the stores, in the plants, in the office, whatever that business is. And then you think of the industries that also got super decimated too, right? Hospitality, and the list goes on. But I think that so about 50% are wanting some mix of mostly remote and some on site. That's what we're hearing so far. But and then again, over 50% are worried about the impact on their recruiting and hiring and retention, depending on if they're requiring everybody back on site.
Yeah, that's the key piece. Yes.
Yeah, and that's what, and they are worried about it, and they're worried about how that's going to impact their inclusive hiring practices too. That maybe some are for the first time trying to actually foster and implement, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, there will be, but we've already heard some anecdotal stories of companies who they've already been required to be back on site, and they've lost critical team members already because of that. And I don't know what the tipping point is, Ron, for C-suite, for leadership to, when they feel that impact. If I don't have those people that I need that are in these critical positions, because they have found remote possibilities elsewhere.
Exactly.
What do we do? Do we have to, does that break us down a little bit at that point? I don't know. Well, it remains to be seen what they end up choosing to do.
Yeah.
But those are the things that we're hearing, and we'll continue to do this again, ongoing side research as we focus on the 2021 benchmark research. But it is top of mind right now. How are you going back to work? What was interesting, because I just read that the California UC and State University systems, and it is related. So let me, I promise, they're going to require all students and faculty to have proof of vaccination to be on campus.
Yeah.
And starting in the fall, and I think, and then, but yet when I'm asking this over 100 companies that have responded in this latest mini survey that we're doing, and I ask, are you going to require proof of vaccination? Very few are so far. Yes. They say they are. It will be interesting to see if that changes or not. I don't know yet. And that, I think that's going to be another difficult, existential question for a lot of organizations to have to answer too. So, but that we'll report back on that when, in fact, I'll be writing something up in the next week or two with this based on this first bit of the data that we got back on what we're hearing and seeing. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you brought that up, because if the model is changing, and I've been following those schools that said that fully vaccinated, you come back. So I mentioned that I did an on-site this past week with a client, but everyone in the room was fully vaccinated, and that was the only reason it was allowed to move forward.
Sure.
So if that is the model, you're not going to be able to buck that. And so if you take it back to the candidate experience, that may be a question that's being asked in that final interview. What is your work model post-COVID?
Yeah.
In that session, if I'm so-called Mr. Big Shot recruiter, and I said, oh, it's fully working in the office, lost, check, I'm out.
And I think that you'll see, here's one of the things that we find every year that's, especially in North America, it trends elsewhere too, but it's always the highest negative reason why candidates withdraw every year. They withdraw because they say their time was disrespected during interviews and appointments. So this isn't, and where I'm going with this is like, if there's two different kinds of disruption, right? That we see in recruiting and hiring. There's systemic disruption, which these are things that were just never been fixed over the years, whether it's an interview process or whatever that is, that's causing angst with candidates, that we're losing people. They're just year after year problems that aren't getting fixed. And then there's transitional disruption, which was COVID, right? Because now suddenly we have to completely virtualize everything. And how do we mitigate that disruption with not only the candidates, but the recruiters and the hiring managers too, right? How do we keep them focused and those rogue hiring managers that still wanted to meet at a coffee shop to interview and not do it on video?
Yeah.
Right. But I think
I know some of those.
Well, I've heard many stories about those, wanting to meet in parking lots in their cars, roll the window down and interview. Fascinating. But I think that it will be, but those things will also, those potential disruptions of, what are you doing? Are you requiring everybody to be on site? And then think about another thing that I haven't read a lot about, but I know it's definitely top of mind. I mean, what's going to happen later this year when you start adjusting salaries for people who aren't in high cost of living areas anymore.
I've been seeing that.
Right. And that have moved, and because they still want to work for tech company X or whoever it is. And, Silicon Valley is what comes tops of mind because it's not that far from me where I live. But how there will be, if it hasn't already happened for some, there will be an adjustment, right? Because I mean, and is that going to cause more disruption and angst with employees that are going to say, wait a minute, what? I mean, just because I wanted to move to Idaho, and I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. And another thing that we haven't really seen yet, but I did an interview with a law firm out of Chicago that does this EEOC report every year that focuses on the cases that EEOC focuses on. And they were telling me, they were kind of forewarning that later this year and into next, we'll probably see employment law litigation spike due to COVID-related issues. Again, people who were told that they could work remotely forever and then now they can't, and end up losing their jobs because of the at-will employment. I mean, I don't even play an employment lawyer on TV, so don't quote me on any of those things. But I think we're going to see more change and disruption going forward in the world of work. So
Can you give us an explanation of EEOC, because we have a global audience and they may not.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Sorry. The
Yeah.
Equal Employment Office. I don't know. Why am I drawing a blank on that?
That's okay. Welcome to the club.
Equal Employment Office of.
Yeah.
Wow. I can't believe it. But Equal Employment Office is what it is. And it's basically, it is a federal agency in the United States.
Workplace. Yeah.
Yeah, that focuses on. See, I don't play Employment Layer on TV, Ron. I told you. They focus on workplace like harassment situations or wrongful termination suits. The list goes on, right? And they follow up with, and they investigate organizations if there's any potential wrongdoing violating state, local, and federal employment laws. Yeah. So that's what they do. And so and they follow the right cases that when it comes to harassment cases and a variety of things and do investigations in companies. But that's what the agency does. It's a federal agency.
Okay. So here's my thought on the salary adjustment, because I've been reading various articles and as it relates to that. And I have a lot of friends that are in employment law, and I've been reading through some of their cases. But my thought is, if I decide to move from, say, Silicon Valley to where I grew up in South Carolina, and I'm living in South Carolina and still doing the same amount of work, still giving you the same deliverables, why should that be an issue? Maybe you focus that on the because of the fact that I was working out of Silicon Valley, where the cost of living, as you know, is extremely high. But wouldn't that balance out over time as I hired people? And one of the questions I may want to find out is where you're going to be working from, and I make the adjustment based on that. In the end, wouldn't it balance out?
Yeah,
I'm not staying there forever.
Yeah, I'll tell you, that's way above my pay grade, Ron.
Yeah.
And I say that jokingly, but it's true. But I think that yes, but I mean it also depends on what was in the original employment agreement with an employee, right? But I don't know if this is uncharted territory. I mean, sounds like you've been talking to some of your employment law friends about these particular cases. I mean, when you say balance out, you're talking about balance out for the employer?
Balance out as I'm hiring more people.
Yeah.
And I'm hiring them based on the salary levels from where they're going to be.
And they're regionally. That is correct. Right.
Yeah. So in the end, even the people that I'm paying this high salary that may be working out of, say, South Carolina, they're not staying there forever. I mean, when you look at the average tenure in these so-called tech firms that we're talking Silicon Valley, it's a little over 2.5 years.
Yeah, tenure's a lot lower now, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
So I mean, it's not like you're going to be hooked into this for 30 years employment. It's not going to happen. Yeah.
So I agree with you on that. I think that, and then if you're going to hire, I mean, and there's a lot more tech hubs too, right? I mean, Nashville and Atlanta, Austin. Well, and Austin's been even for like San Jose. It's kind of like the sister city to San Jose, right? And it's been, but I think that there's a lot more tech hubs and the ability to. This kind of connects to when I hear a business leader say, "We just can't find the right people."
Yeah, right.
And I just that makes me kind of cringe, right? Because then you're just not looking, right?
That's not even an excuse. Don't ever use that again.
No, but you're right. I do think that if I'm hiring more regionally, then it's going to pay commensurate to what that region's compensation on average looks like. But to reduce individuals because they choose to move elsewhere, you're probably going to be losing folks. I mean, again, unless I really, really want to stay with the company, I can figure out how to negotiate something. Where's that give and take? I don't know. But you're right. I think that it will balance out if I'm going to hire in these other tech hubs. But some of those markets, though, they've been heating up, like Nashville, right? So so pay rates are going to go up accordingly too. But I mean, I think that's the thing. Unless they have to absolutely be on site, we can hire from anywhere. anymore.
You can hire from anywhere. So you got work from home. You got, and the next step from work from home is working from anywhere. So I was in a situation with IBM years ago, and I was promoted to a position that I had to move to Seattle, Washington.
Yeah.
And I did not take the promotion because I was not going to move from Seattle, Washington. My parents were still in South Carolina, and they were aging. They were going back and forth to the doctors and all those things. And I'm on the East Coast. I can jump on a flight and be there in a few hours, as opposed to flying all the way across country and having all that stress. And I refused it. But at IBM at that time, it was okay to do that because I had a reason as to why I was doing it. And it was good that I did do that because what happened, they eventually closed that division down. And I would have been, I don't mean to say this in a negative way, I would have been stuck in Seattle and trying to get back to the East Coast.
It's something you never would have known, right? Until you made that decision and then end up being in the place where, and that's, that is also part of the game, again, that the impacts that are on businesses all the time and the decisions that are made that impact their employees that make those decisions, right? That's a pretty big life decision. And I think what we are seeing, there has been an exodus from California and other high cost of living areas to lower cost of living areas. I mean, there's that documented research and data is out there now, and I've lived in the Bay Area now it's funny, I've been all over the world, Ron, and I've lived in 3 cities, and they've all been in California.
Okay.
So I grew up in the Central Valley, and then I moved to San Jose, and then I live in Santa Cruz now. But and that's worked for me, right? But there's people who are established in their communities, and I don't have any immediate data on this, but anecdotally, they don't want to go anywhere else, right? But they do. There's potentially going to be more opportunity for them to stay where they're at.
Okay.
I would argue. So
yeah. So in closing, I want to ask you a question for HR people or senior leaders that are listening to this call. How can I begin the process? If we've never given it a thought, how can I begin the process of trying to pulse this candidate experience?
So
even a rudimentary process, what should I be capturing?
So if you were to just, sit down with your HR and recruiting leaders and say, we really, there's something here. I know we want to make a priority of improving our recruiting and hiring process. There's some really key questions. One of them for sure is, based on your experience, how willing are you to refer others to our organization?
Okay.
And the referral one. So, a lot of companies that are doing what we call continuous feedback, they're only asking 3 to 5, maybe 10 questions max.
Okay.
Not any more than that, but referrals I would argue, is a big universal one. There may be some demographic information you're capturing. Our surveys are all anonymous, right? So the candidates, it's anonymous to them. So we want them to speak freely on behalf of the employers they had just applied to, because that's the data we want to get to the employers that you want to. And yes, there's a negative skew. That's always a question that comes up in an argument. Aren't I just going to get the ones who are just angry all the time? Yeah. And I would argue, no. There's a negative skew because it doesn't matter how great your recruiting and hiring processes are. At the moment you tell somebody you're not going to pursue them any further, it always goes south. That's what happens, and we see that in our data. Yeah. But asking questions, a few questions about your experience with the recruiters, with the hiring managers, and would you be willing to do things again with us based on your experience? Okay. That's where I would start.
Okay, so that's kind of framing it. So I'm coming back to you to try and build a better candidate experience kind of approach, and can you give us some feedback on that?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what it is. Thank you very much for you're always acknowledging, thank you for taking the time to apply for one of our jobs, right? We really are trying to do a better job in recruiting and hiring, and would love for your feedback. Please take a minute and complete this survey. We would appreciate it. And companies can, response rates can vary. When they do it directly, they can get 10, 15, 20, 30% response rate. We conservatively in our benchmark research get 5%, although larger companies it's higher. But conservatively speaking, which is still higher than third-party industry standard, which is maybe 1 to 2% response rate in survey research like this. But the fact of the matter is, you will get enough of a baseline to get an understanding of what that candidate journey is like and how it's being rated. And there's different scales. We do a lot of 4 and 5 point scales, which are easily converted to Net Promoter, which is a direction a lot of companies are going, is Net Promoter.
Okay, cool. Kevin, can you give us the website? You mentioned the Candy Awards, and that's CNE Awards. That's correct, right?
It is. So the Talent Board is actually the name of the company and the Candidate Experience Awards, but it's just really easy. It's thetalentboard.org. Thetalentboard.org. You got to put the in there. So talentboard.org. That's our website. Oh, are you there, Ron? Are you there?
I think we lost him for a while.
I think we lost Ron at the end. That's all right.
We just wait for a few seconds. If he's not back, then we just.
That's fine. I can talk to him later too. So, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, we'll close it out.
Okay. Thanks again. Okay.